She hadn't spoken in nearly a year, until the day a muddy golden retriever appeared on her porch and looked her in the eyes. In a town that had forgotten how to listen, one silent girl, a grieving father, and a lonely painter were about to find their voices again, not through words, but through colors, memories, and the quiet loyalty of a dog who refused to leave. The town of Marigold Ridge stirred under a dull gray sky as the morning drizzle soaked the narrow roads and pine-lined sidewalks. It was the kind of town where the fog rolled in and never quite rolled back out, and where the scent of cedar and chimney smoke hung in the air like a memory you couldn't shake. The Morgan residence sat quietly at the edge of a wooded trail, a modest single-story house with faded blue shutters and a crooked mailbox that leaned forward like it was tired of waiting for good news. The windows were always drawn, and the yard was overgrown with dry grass and fallen pine needles. 12-year-old Eliza Morgan stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass. She didn't speak anymore. Not since the car accident 8 months ago that took her mother's life. Since then, Eliza hadn't uttered a single word. Her once lively brown eyes had dulled, and her face, framed by straight, dark hair often tucked behind her ears, had settled into an expressionless calm that unnerved most people. She wasn't sullen, just silent, living in a world of charcoal sketches and paper cutouts taped to her bedroom wall. Her voice had not vanished physically, doctors confirmed that, but something deeper had frozen shut inside her. Sam Morgan, her father, was a quiet man in his late 30s with calloused hands, a square jaw lined with stubble, and a permanent furrow etched into his brow. Once known for his warmth and humor, Sam now wore grief like a coat he couldn't take off. He worked as a carpenter, mostly alone in the workshop behind their house. He rarely smiled, and he spoke even less, except when necessary, and even then, with effort, like each word was made of stone. This morning, as the wind shifted and blew pine needles across the porch, Eliza turned away from the window and noticed something just beyond the screen door. A shape, still and gold-colored, huddled near the old flower pots on the porch step. Sam stepped out first. "What the?" he muttered, reaching for the handle cautiously. Lying curled up and soaked was a golden retriever. The dog was lanky, its ribs faintly visible beneath matted, rain-drenched fur. Its ears drooped low, and one paw was curled protectively beneath its chest. Mud caked the fur along its back legs, and its nose was scratched, raw like it had been digging or searching. Yet its amber eyes, though tired, held no fear, only the quiet resignation of something that had been waiting too long. The dog looked up at Sam, then at Eliza behind the screen. It didn't bark, didn't flinch. It merely blinked slowly and lowered its head back onto its paws, as if deciding this porch would do, for now. Sam frowned. "Must have been out here all night," he muttered. "No collar. No tags." He squatted beside the dog, inspecting its body with the eye of someone who had once raised retrievers before Eliza was born. Not old. Maybe 4 years. Male. Probably got dumped off the highway. Eliza opened the door slightly. The floor creaked under her bare feet. The dog lifted his head again, just a bit, as if acknowledging her presence. Then, slowly, he nudged his head forward and licked the rain from her fingers. Eliza didn't pull away. Her eyes didn't widen, nor did she cry. But she crouched down, level with him, and reached out to brush the mud off his ear. "Guess we have a visitor," Sam said dryly, but didn't push the animal away. They let him inside the garage, set out an old towel and some leftover stew. The dog ate with gentle movements, never ravenous, as if aware he was being observed and trying to be polite. Eliza sat nearby with her sketchbook in her lap, watching him with the alert stillness of someone who just stumbled upon something extraordinary but couldn't name it. That evening, when the clouds broke and sunlight flickered briefly through the western trees, Sam caught sight of the first drawing Eliza had made since her mother's passing. It was rough, charcoal on textured paper, the dog, lying on the porch, his eyes half shut in the rain. She had shaded in the wetness along his back. She'd drawn the porch steps in detail. Most startling of all, she'd written something in tiny print below it. "Not alone." Sam didn't say anything. He sat down beside her on the old couch in the garage, watched the dog sleep. "We're not keeping him," he said, but it came out softer than he intended. Eliza didn't answer, but she slid the sketch closer to him. Down the road, at the very end of Marigold Lane, an elderly woman peered from her lace-draped window. Ruby Talbot was a thin, bird-like woman with wispy silver hair pulled into a loose bun and thick round glasses perched too low on her nose. Her life had shrunk in recent years to her cluttered bungalow, a parlor of oil paintings, and quiet walks with a cane along the fence line. Once a respected art teacher in town, she had retreated from public life after arthritis bent her fingers and her students stopped writing. This morning, though, Ruby had sensed something. A bark, low, distinct, followed by silence. She'd shuffled toward her window just in time to see the golden figure lying on the Morgan porch. Her eyes narrowed, and something flickered behind her gaze. She hadn't seen a retriever like that since. No, it couldn't be. She turned back from the window, shuffled toward her fireplace, and reached for a small wooden box tucked behind a row of watercolor jars. She opened it slowly, revealing a faded photograph, a young woman holding a golden retriever, smiling in the sun. Ruby Talbot stood in the quiet of her home, her fingers trembling slightly, and said aloud to no one in particular, "It's her eyes, that dog has her eyes." The morning after Sunny arrived, Marigold Ridge wore its usual coat of mist, clinging stubbornly to the treetops and rooftops like breath held in waiting. Pine cones littered the damp sidewalks, and the wooden fences glistened faintly from the prior evening's rain. The Morgan house, still silent as ever, now held one additional presence, a golden thread of warmth curled on an old braided rug just inside the garage door. Sunny, as Eliza had started calling him in her head, though never aloud, lay still beside the space heater that Sam had reluctantly plugged in. The dog's eyes followed Eliza wherever she went, never demanding, just quietly alert, like he had some old wisdom and had chosen her as its keeper. That morning, Eliza Morgan stood in the corner of the garage beside her easel, a repurposed music stand Sam had modified for her when she was still attending art classes. Her sketchbook, always within reach, was open to a half-finished charcoal drawing, Sunny curled beside the porch, a low lantern casting a triangle of soft light over his fur. She stared at it, fingers smudged with charcoal dust, but her mind wasn't in the strokes. It was on the soft, rhythmic breathing behind her. Eliza was dressed in her usual oversized hoodie, forest green and speckled with paint stains, and faded jeans tucked into rubber boots. Her dark hair was tied in a low, slightly messy ponytail, strands always slipping free. Her movements were quiet but deliberate, as though each action had weight. Sunny slowly stood and padded toward her, stretching first one leg and then the other. He gave a soft huff and placed his head under her free hand. Eliza didn't flinch, she just let her fingers run down the soft fur of his neck. Sam watched from the back door, his coffee growing cold in his hand. The sight of Eliza sketching again, not just lines or shadows, but something alive, had awakened a part of him that had gone numb. He'd stayed up late the night before fixing a broken wooden stool Eliza used to rest her foot while she drew. Something about this dog had shifted the air between them. He didn't say it, but he felt it. Later that afternoon, a small package appeared on the Morgan front step. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with faded green yarn. Inside was a worn metal tin of watercolor paints, the classic kind with a hinge that creaked when opened, and a folded note in delicate, looping script. For someone who sees beyond outlines. Use these, and let them sing again. RT. Sam furrowed his brow. RT, he murmured. Eliza picked up the tin, gently turning it in her hands. Her fingers brushed over the slight dent in the top corner, then lingered. Without a word, she carried it to her room. At the far end of the lane, Ruby Talbot watched from her parlor window, satisfied. The elderly woman had always preferred indirect kindness, gestures, not grand speeches. Ruby had once been a beloved art teacher at Marigold Middle School, known for bringing color into places where it didn't belong, sidewalks, fire hydrants, utility poles. But time had faded her name, and arthritis had stiffened her hands. These days, her world was reduced to the parlor with its overstuffed chair, faded floral carpet, and paintings stacked against the walls like neglected thoughts. Ruby's cane, carved from driftwood by a former student, leaned against the window frame. She had spent the better part of the morning sorting through her attic for old supplies. When she came across that paint tin, she remembered who she'd given it to last, Eliza's mother, Claire Morgan, her former student. Claire had been Ruby's brightest star, vibrant, instinctive, always painting in bursts of raw, unfiltered color. Claire had once painted a mural on Ruby's garden shed without asking. Ruby had laughed for days. Now, Claire was gone. And Ruby had recognized her daughter the moment she saw Eliza's sketch pinned to the hardware store noticeboard the week before, a charcoal rendition of the post office, perfectly shaded. The girl had her mother's eye for light. And now, apparently, a golden retriever with eyes that didn't judge. Back at the Morgan house, Eliza stood before a blank sheet of thick watercolor paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she dipped the long-forgotten brush into the water and dabbed the first spot of color, gold, then gray, then a sliver of blue. Slowly, the image began to emerge, a soft outline of Sonny with light falling across his back in gentle bands. She didn't smile, but her breathing slowed, deepened. Sam walked past her room, pausing briefly in the doorway. He didn't say a word, only nodded and moved on. But later that night, he quietly installed a brighter bulb in her reading lamp, and left a new pack of watercolor paper on the table. The next morning, Eliza placed her first finished watercolor, a portrait of Sonny, lying on the porch with rain falling softly behind him, in a Ziploc bag and carried it to the garage. She taped it to the wooden cabinet near Sonny's sleeping rug. The dog approached it, sniffed once, and looked at her. She touched his head and mouthed the words, "Thank you," though no sound came out. That night, as the moon crested over the pines, Ruby scribbled in her small journal with stiff fingers. She wrote, "The child sees. The dog listens. Perhaps I wasn't forgotten after all." Sunlight streamed across the hills of Marigold Ridge like threads of gold unraveling from the sky. The fog had lifted for once, and the pine trees stood proud against the clear backdrop of blue, their shadows casting long fingers across the ground. The air carried the scent of sawdust and chimney smoke, familiar, grounding, almost warm. Inside the Morgan backyard, the woodshop stood like a quiet monument, a weathered barn-red structure with a patched tin roof and narrow windows streaked with resin from years past. Sam Morgan stood at his workbench, sleeves rolled up, wood shavings clinging to his arms. He was building a new cabinet for a local diner, not for the money, but to keep his hands busy. He moved with precision, the kind born of years shaping things into meaning, even when the world no longer offered reasons. He had changed little since his younger years, tall, lean, with broad shoulders that carried more than just timber. But now, there was a sag to his stance when he thought no one was looking, and lines around his eyes carved deeper each time Eliza walked silently past him without meeting his gaze. That morning, as Sam planed a cherrywood panel, he heard the familiar pad of paws. Sonny had taken to following him into the shop, tail swaying like a gentle metronome. The golden retriever moved carefully, sensing the importance of tools and shavings and rhythm. He didn't bark or demand. He just sat near the old potbelly stove that Sam had relit for the season, curling up with a sigh like he'd earned the right to rest there. Sam glanced down at the dog. "You're not bad company," he said gruffly, not expecting an answer. But Sonny, sensing the warmth in Sam's tone, lifted his head and gave a soft woof, not loud, not startling, just enough to say, "I'm here." At that exact moment, Eliza entered through the side door. She was holding something in her hands, a sheet of watercolor paper, slightly warped from moisture. Sam turned slowly as she approached. Her steps were cautious, unsure, but she crossed the shop until she stood beside the finished cabinet, then gently placed the painting atop it. It was Sonny again, but different, this time lying beside the wood stove in the workshop, with light catching the curve of his back and the scattered wood shavings around him. The tones were muted, soft browns and oranges, and Sam could tell she'd used a brush with intent. He stared at it longer than he intended. "You drew this, just now?" he asked, though he knew she wouldn't answer. Eliza didn't nod or shake her head. She simply turned and pointed to the stool in the corner, the one he had repaired for her in silence 2 nights ago. It was a message, and he heard it. "Well," he murmured, clearing his throat, "guess I better hang it up somewhere good." That night, as Sam framed the painting and placed it on a shelf in the corner of the shop, he caught himself humming a tune he hadn't touched in years. He didn't even realize he was doing it until Sonny tilted his head, listening. Meanwhile, across town, Ruby Talbot sat at her kitchen table wrapped in a crocheted shawl, her hands trembling as she tried to slice a green apple. Her movements were slow now, the arthritis having stiffened her fingers like tree roots, and the knife slipped slightly, nicking her thumb. She hissed softly and reached for a napkin. Her doctor's words from the day before echoed in her ears. "Miss Talbot, it's time we talked about hospice options. The heart is failing, you've got months, not years." Ruby hadn't cried. She hadn't argued either. She had merely stared out the window at the wind chimes on her porch. But today, something had changed. Something inside her stirred when she spotted a note tacked onto the community bulletin board near the library. It was a child's drawing, watercolor. A golden dog in a woodshop, curled near a stove. Signed only with a small red stamp, a circle with a pinecone in the center. Ruby's breath had caught in her chest. It was Eliza. And that meant one thing, the girl had taken the paints, and more importantly, she was using them. Now, Ruby sat at her cluttered table, turning over ideas in her head. If her body couldn't keep up, maybe her past could serve someone else's future. She pushed aside the apple slices and reached for a dusty leather folio, her old teaching journal, filled with notes from years of art classes. Lessons, philosophies, quotes. She flipped through it until she found one phrase underlined 3 times. "We do not teach children to paint. We teach them to see." Her eyes welled up, but not from sadness. She folded the journal closed, picked up the old rotary phone mounted to the wall, and dialed a number she hadn't called in nearly a decade. "Marigold Ridge Elementary," said a voice. "This is Ruby Talbot. I used to teach there. I'd like to donate some supplies, and maybe volunteer. Just a little." A pause. Then, a kind reply, "Ms. Talbot, we'd be honored." Back in the woodshop, Eliza watched Sam work on a new birdhouse. She sat in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, sketching him, not just his form, but his posture, the way his hands curled just slightly at the edge of the chisel. She captured the line of tension in his back and the softness that appeared only when Sonny brushed against his leg. She wasn't ready to speak, not yet. But her hands spoke for her now, through color, through form, through the dog who had walked into their lives without a name but had given them all something new. The wind in Marigold Ridge had changed. There was a crispness in the air now, sharp with the scent of pine bark and wood smoke. Leaves rustled like old paper overhead, and golden patches of sun flickered across the ground through thinning canopies. Eliza Morgan stepped onto the porch with her sketchbook tucked under one arm and Sonny trailing behind her like a living shadow. The dog's coat had begun to shine again, brushed, clean, with a hint of golden fire when caught in the right light. She sat on the top porch step, resting her sketchbook across her lap. Her worn hoodie had faded further at the elbows, and her jeans were flecked with watercolor pigment, but she no longer moved like someone tiptoeing through a world that might break. Sonny lay beside her, head resting against her knee. She reached down and scratched gently between his ears before flipping open the book. Today's page was blank. That was rare. But Eliza wasn't stuck. She was waiting. From the corner of her eye, she noticed something near the edge of the porch, barely tucked beneath it, hidden under the slats. She reached down and pulled free a small cardboard box, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red string. A faint scent of lavender and linseed oil rose from it. Inside was a thin sketchbook with a leather spine, and on the first page, written in gentle cursive, were the words. For Eliza. Let the world pass through you, and give it back gently. R.T. Beneath the note was a dried flower, a marigold, pressed and still faintly yellow. Eliza traced the stem with one finger. Then she turned the page and began to sketch, first lightly, then with increasing certainty, pine branches, a winding path, and Sonny standing at its edge, looking ahead. From the window, Sam Morgan watched silently. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask. But when Eliza later stepped inside and handed him a small folded piece of paper, a copy of the marigold she'd drawn with faint watercolor tones, he pinned it beside the thermostat without a word. At the end of the lane, Ruby Talbot was sitting at her dining room table with her coat on, an envelope in her lap. She had been waiting for the bus into town, but her breath was shallow today. The short walk from the mailbox had left her needing her inhaler. Still, her eyes had a fire that hadn't been there in months. Across the table sat a young man in his 20s, tall and lean with tousled brown hair and dark eyes framed by heavy glasses. This was Micah Voss, a part-time volunteer from the town's art foundation, recently assigned to help elderly residents catalog and donate old artworks. Micah had a quiet, attentive demeanor, polite but genuine, and Ruby had taken to him almost immediately. His passion for preserving forgotten works aligned perfectly with her need to be heard one last time. Micah lifted one of Ruby's older canvases, a dusky image of the Marigold town square at dusk. This one's beautiful. Was this the piece that hung in City Hall? Ruby gave a small nod, her voice thinner today. They stored it in the janitor's closet when they repainted. Said it didn't match the new aesthetic. Micah winced. Then we'll hang it somewhere better. Ruby opened the envelope in her lap and passed him 3 folded letters, 2 addressed to the elementary school principal and 1 to the Morgan household. Would you deliver these for me? She asked. Of course, he said gently. Back at the Morgan home, Sam opened the envelope with his name in fine ink across the front. Inside was a simple letter. Mr. Morgan. I once taught your wife to paint. She was joy in human form, and she spoke often of you and your daughter, even when she was still just a dream. Now I see that dream, in flesh and color, standing strong beside the dog who chose her. If you and Eliza are willing, I would like to meet her. Not to intrude, just to offer what time I have left. Respectfully. Ruby Talbot. Sam read the letter twice. Then again. He stood for a long moment in the kitchen, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. When Eliza walked in, he passed it to her without a word. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. Sonny, sensing something significant, sat upright between them. Eliza nodded. Just once. Then she retrieved her new sketchbook and carefully tore out the marigold drawing she'd done earlier that day. She placed it in a clean envelope and handed it to her father. Sam smiled faintly. I'll deliver this tomorrow. That evening, Eliza and Sonny took their usual walk along the narrow trail behind their house. It led to a bluff overlooking the valley where the sun dipped low behind tall firs. She stopped at a small stump they had claimed as their own and began to draw, not Sonny this time, but herself and the dog, side by side, looking out into a horizon painted in faint golds and burnt orange. The wind picked up and scattered dry leaves across her page, but she didn't stop. Marigold Ridge had a way of transforming once every autumn. As the season tipped toward harvest and the days grew shorter, the townspeople began preparing for the annual Lantern Festival, a tradition older than the street signs and worn benches it illuminated. For one night, the entire town became a soft-lit wonderland, with paper lanterns strung from rooftops to street lamps, glowing like floating memories. That evening, Eliza Morgan stood on the front porch in a simple navy dress, her long dark hair combed neatly and tied at the nape of her neck with a piece of ribbon, her mother's old ribbon, pulled from the bottom of a drawer. Her boots were still muddy and her fingernails stained with paint, but she didn't look undone. She looked real, balanced between memory and newness. Beside her sat Sonny, now clean and strong, his coat brushed until it gleamed in the lantern light like polished gold. He wore a makeshift collar stitched from old leather, with a small brass tag that simply read, Sonny. Sam had engraved it by hand in the shop 2 days earlier. Sam himself stepped out behind them, adjusting the cuffs of his flannel shirt. "You ready?" he asked, the words still awkward but more natural now. Eliza nodded, then held up a folder of watercolor paintings, all sealed in plastic. Sam took the box she handed him, a makeshift display case he'd helped her build in the wood shop, and they started down the path toward town. The festival had transformed Main Street. Local musicians strummed soft guitar tunes near the bakery, and the scent of roasted corn and spiced cider filled the air. Children ran with glowing paper lanterns shaped like owls, foxes, and moons. Every window displayed artwork from the local school, the church, the Veterans Hall. And now, a little stall with a handmade wooden sign that read, Eliza's Light. Sam set up the display as Eliza arranged the paintings, Sonny beside the wood stove, Sonny under the pine trees, Sonny looking out toward the valley, and finally, one of Eliza and Sonny together, painted in soft golden tones that looked like sunlight itself. A few townsfolk stopped to admire the paintings. Some recognized the girl. Others asked quiet questions. Eliza didn't speak, but she offered a small nod or glance in response. Sam, sensing her nerves, stepped aside and let her take her space. Sonny lay protectively beside the table, his head resting on his paws, eyes alert but calm. Then came the voice. "Those are more than pictures. They're stories." Eliza turned to see Ruby Talbot approaching slowly, guided by Micah Voss, who walked beside her like a respectful grandson. Ruby wore a deep maroon shawl and held her cane like a walking stick used to climb mountains. Her face, though pale and thin, lit with pride and warmth. Eliza looked at her, truly looked, and saw the same eyes she'd seen in the mirror when she drew, when she missed her mother, when she felt something she couldn't name. The two stared at one another in silence, the crowd fading around them. Then Eliza reached into the folder and pulled out one final painting, a scene of an old woman sitting beside a cluttered parlor window, looking out toward a glowing sky with pine trees silhouetted in the frame. The caption read, in careful, uneven lettering, "We see with our hearts first." Ruby's eyes filled instantly. Her lips trembled. She whispered, "You are her daughter." Eliza stepped forward, and for the first time in nearly a year, her voice came, not strong, not full, but steady. She looked up at Ruby and said softly, "Thank you, for the colors." Micah looked between them, stunned. Sam turned sharply, eyes wide. He stared at Eliza, speechless. Ruby took Eliza's hand in both of hers, frail fingers barely able to close. In the square, the mayor announced the start of the lantern release. One by one, townspeople lit the base of each paper lantern and watched them lift into the sky. They floated upward, carrying names and wishes and silent prayers. Eliza lit one, then looked at her father. "Can we write something?" Sam's throat tightened. He handed her a pen. Eliza leaned down and wrote, "For Mom, we found the light again." She passed it to Sam, who signed beneath it, hands shaking. They let it go together. As the lantern rose, Sonny barked once, not loud, but full of joy. The town watched, some clapping, others wiping their eyes. Eliza stood in the center, not hiding, not silent, with Sonny beside her, the quiet dog who had carried her voice back to the world. The final days of October fell softly over Marigold Ridge like a curtain drawn in slow motion. Leaves rustled in quieter tones now, their brilliant reds and oranges fading into brittle gold. The streets calmed after the excitement of the Lantern Festival, and the town exhaled, content, for a while. On the western edge of town, the Morgan home had changed too, though not outwardly. The grass still needed mowing. The shutters still tilted. But laughter, soft and rare, had returned to its walls. In the backyard, the old tool shed had been cleaned out, repainted, and reborn. Where once cobwebs clung to rusted nails and broken rakes, now stood shelves filled with paint jars, brushes, blank canvases, and watercolor pads stacked like quiet invitations. The word studio had been stenciled on the wooden door in teal paint. Above it, Sam had installed a carved wooden plaque, Claire's Corner, named for Eliza's mother. Inside, Eliza sat at a low table surrounded by 3 neighborhood kids, all under the age of 10. They were quiet at first, unsure what to say or how to act. But when Sunny curled beside them and Eliza handed each child a small marigold sticker to place on their first sketch page, the energy shifted. They began to draw. Birds. Houses. A very lopsided cat. And slowly, the space filled with the sound of laughter and pencil scratches. Eliza had not returned fully to speaking. Her words were still rare, gentle, and only when truly meant. But no one needed noise to feel her presence now. She communicated through nods, through touch, through color, and the kids followed her lead like she was a conductor with an invisible baton. Sunny, now full of strength and warmth, moved between them like an old soul reincarnated as a dog. Sam stood at the open door, arms crossed, watching with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The man who had once only built cabinets now built space for healing, for joy, for returning. Later that afternoon, a familiar silver sedan pulled into their driveway. Micah Voss stepped out from the driver's side and gently helped Ruby Talbot from the passenger seat. She was wrapped in the same maroon shawl from the festival, her cane steadier today, her step slow but firm. Eliza was the first to see her. She rose from the table and walked across the yard without hesitation. When she reached Ruby, she took the older woman's hand and squeezed it, not hard, not dramatic, just enough. Ruby smiled. "I was hoping to see your studio before the frost sets in," she said. Eliza nodded and led her inside. The room went still as Ruby entered. She looked around the warm space, sunlight streaming through sheer curtains, the scent of pine and watercolor in the air. She saw her old tin of paint sitting on a shelf, her pressed marigold framed on the wall, and her heart swelled. "I dreamed of this once," Ruby said softly, placing a hand to her chest. "A space where what we pass down becomes something new." Micah approached with a canvas wrapped in parchment. "She wanted you to have this," he told Eliza, placing it in her hands. "It's from her attic." Eliza unwrapped it slowly. Inside was an old painting, a woman kneeling in a garden surrounded by marigolds, a young golden retriever lying beside her, eyes bright. It was Claire, her mother, as a teenager. Eliza pressed the canvas to her chest. Sam stepped forward, blinking back tears. "She always said she painted joy," Ruby whispered. "Now, so do you." They stayed like that for a while, standing in silence broken only by the faint barking of kids chasing Sunny in the yard. At sunset, Sam walked Ruby back to the car. As she reached the door, she turned to him. "You're a builder, Mr. Morgan. Not just of wood. Of places where people become whole again." He nodded, voice caught in his throat. That evening, as the sun set low and the town turned golden, Eliza and Sam sat together on the porch steps. Sunny rested between them, head on Eliza's foot. In the distance, the hills shimmered with the last light of day, and the town fell quiet. "Do you think Mom would like it?" Eliza asked quietly, her voice a whisper of breath. Sam didn't answer right away. He looked out at the studio glowing faintly from inside, at the laughter that still echoed from the kids, at the marigold drawing pinned to the porch beam. "I think she already does," he said. Eliza smiled. And in that moment, the road they traveled, through silence, through grief, through the quiet courage of a dog, had finally turned gold. Healing doesn't always begin with answers, sometimes it starts with presence. Whether it's a gentle paw, a stroke of color, or the quiet act of showing up, the road to hope is rarely loud. But when love is passed on, even in silence, it can turn the darkest path into gold.